I didn't want to do it at first, and they'd been after me to do one for about 2 years. And I thought, well, you know, there's going to be 22,000 people there, so we can throw in some new songs maybe and everything. But as it turned out, we didn't. We played all old songs, and they just sort of stared at us. And played all old songs, and they just sort of stared at us. And it was a strange experience, really. It was about 6 months ago.
On New Year's Eve, 1985, a plume of smoke tore across the Texas sky. Inside a stricken DC-3 aircraft, panic erupted as the cabin filled with toxic fumes. The plane, carrying one of America's first and most beloved teen idols, was going down. When the wreckage of Ricky Nelson's private plane was found smoldering in a field near DeKalb, the headlines painted a grim, familiar picture. Here was a man who had everything: the face, the fame, the family, and seemingly lost it all. The story that took hold in the days and weeks after was one of tragedy compounded by failure. Ricky Nelson, the golden boy of the 1950s, had died roughly $1 million in debt, leaving his 4 children with nothing but a legacy of financial ruin. For years, that was the story everyone believed. It was a cautionary tale of a child star who couldn't escape the shadow of his own youth. But hidden within the grooves of his timeless music, buried under decades of complex contracts, was a secret asset so powerful it would ignite a bitter, years-long legal war. This battle would pit his heirs against 2 of the biggest music corporations on the planet. In the end, it would unearth a fortune that no one, not his creditors, not the media, not even his own children, saw coming. This is the unbelievable story of how Ricky Nelson's supposed legacy of debt was transformed into a multi-million-dollar fortune for his family. To get why everyone thought Ricky Nelson died broke, you first have to get just how big he really was. Before Elvis Presley scandalized a nation on The Ed Sullivan Show, Ricky Nelson was already a household name, beamed into American living rooms every week. Born Eric Hilliard Nelson, he was the youngest son of Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, the masterminds behind the iconic sitcom, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. The show, which started on radio and moved to TV in 1952, was a cultural phenomenon. At its heart were the 2 Nelson boys, David and the impossibly handsome Ricky. Audiences literally watched Ricky grow up on screen. But in 1957, that image was fused with a new, electrifying identity. Trying to impress a girlfriend who loved Elvis, Ricky told his dad he wanted to make a record. Ozzie, ever the savvy showman, arranged a recording session. The result was a cover of Fats Domino's I'm Walkin'. To promote it, an episode of Ozzie and Harriet was written where Ricky performs the song. The effect was seismic. The single sold over 1 million copies in a week. Suddenly, Ricky Nelson wasn't just a TV star, he was a rock and roll sensation. For the next 5 years, his success was staggering. He dominated the charts, placing over 50 songs on the Billboard Hot 100 between 1957 and 1973. Hits like Poor Little Fool, Lonesome Town, Hello Mary Lou, and Travelin' Man defined the sound of an era. In fact, Poor Little Fool holds the distinction of being the very first #1 song on Billboard's newly created Hot 100 chart in 1958. He was the original teen idol, a mix of safe, boy-next-door charm and the cool swagger of rock and roll. His contract with Imperial Records was unheard of for a teenager, guaranteeing him a huge salary and, critically, creative control. But pop culture moves fast. In the mid-1960s, the British invasion arrived, and the clean-cut sound of early American rock felt dated. Nelson tried to adapt, dropping the Y to become Rick and pivoting to country rock. This shift produced one of his most enduring hits, Garden Party, written after he was booed at a Madison Square Garden concert for playing new material. The lyrics became his motto, "You can't please everyone, so you got to please yourself." While he continued to tour relentlessly, that massive chart-topping success was gone. The financial pressure mounted. The real drain, however, came from his personal life. His passionate but volatile marriage to Kristen Harmon ended in a bitter divorce finalized in 1982. The legal battle cost him over $1 million, a sum that crippled him financially. In his final years, Ricky was on a treadmill, playing small clubs and casinos to pay off debts. To save money, he bought a vintage 1944 Douglas DC-3 airplane with a history of engine problems that worried his band. It was this plane that would become his coffin. His death at 45 cemented the public story. A golden boy who flew too close to the sun and crashed, his fortune and life extinguished. The story, it seemed, was over. In the wake of the tragic crash, the story of Ricky Nelson's finances went from bad to worse. Headlines painted a picture of a man who left behind only chaos. Initial court filings suggested his estate wasn't just empty, but about $1 million in the red from unpaid taxes, divorce fees, and the upkeep on the very plane that killed him. It appeared his children were inheriting a mountain of debt. The situation was a total mess, legally and emotionally. There were his 4 children, Tracy, Gunnar, Matthew, and Sam. There was his ex-wife Chris Harmon and his fiancée, Helen Blair, who died with him in the crash. Complicating things further was Eric Crew, who had filed a paternity suit years earlier claiming to be Nelson's son. For a while, everyone believed Ricky had died without a will. But then, his older brother, David Nelson, produced a will signed just 4 months before the crash. It was explosive. Ricky had left his entire estate to his 4 children and named David as the executor. He specifically excluded everyone else: his ex-wife, his mother, his late fiancé, and, by omission, the man claiming to be his son. This will kicked off a legal firestorm. Helen Blair's parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit. Eric Crew pushed his paternity claim. Chris Harmon, cut out of the will, fought for her children's interests. It was a heartbreaking public spectacle. America's perfect TV family was now a real-life drama, fighting over what looked like financial wreckage. As executor, David Nelson's first job was to pay the creditors. But with more debt than assets, the estate was officially declared insolvent. The physical assets, some property, belongings, cash, weren't enough to cover what was owed. For years, this was the reality. The children of a rock and roll pioneer would get nothing. But the true fortune wasn't in a bank account. It was buried in the master tapes of his recordings and the complex language of his music contracts, an invisible asset waiting to be discovered. For nearly a decade, the Ricky Nelson estate languished. His children grew up, with Gunnar and Matthew forming the successful rock band Nelson. But as the music industry entered a new era, the estate's advisors began looking at old contracts with fresh eyes, and they started seeing huge discrepancies. The problem was rooted in contracts from the 1950s, written for a world of vinyl records. These agreements had deductions for things like packaging costs for the album sleeve and breakage for records that might break during shipping. As music moved to CDs and then digital files, these old contracts were often applied without any changes. This is where the estate first saw an opening. In 2011, they filed a lawsuit against Capitol Records, which owned his classic catalog. The claim was simple. How can you deduct packaging and breakage costs on a digital file? An MP3 doesn't have a package. It can't break. The suit argued these were phantom costs, letting the label skim money off the top. It also alleged Capitol was holding on to a massive slush fund of unmatched income it claimed it couldn't link to any artist. After a 3-year battle, a confidential settlement was reached in 2014. It was the first proof that the story of a worthless estate was wrong. But the real fight was for the fortune of the future: streaming. By the late 2010s, artists' estates noticed that while streaming revenue was huge, the royalty checks felt small. The Nelson estate's advisors dug into the royalty statements from Sony Music and found something they believed was deeply wrong. In 2018, they filed a landmark class action lawsuit against Sony. The suit targeted intercompany charges. The argument was this. When a Ricky Nelson song was streamed in Germany, Sony Germany collected the money. Before sending it to the parent company in the U.S., it would deduct a massive fee, sometimes as high as 68%. The estate's royalty was then calculated from this much smaller amount. The lawsuit argued that since Sony Germany and Sony US are the same company, this was just a way to artificially shrink the pot of money paid to artists. This case was bigger than just Ricky Nelson. It represented potentially thousands of legacy artists. In September 2020, a blockbuster settlement was announced. While denying wrongdoing, Sony agreed to create a $12.7 million fund for the class action members. But the biggest win wasn't the one-time payment. As part of the deal, Sony also agreed to increase the future royalty rate on foreign streams for all class members by 36%. This was the game changer. They hadn't just recovered past earnings, they had turned on a pipeline of much higher income for decades to come. The transformation was complete. A story that began with $1 million debt ended in multi-million-dollar legal victories. The narrative of a faded, broke star was shattered and replaced by a more complex truth. Ricky Nelson created a body of work so valuable that it could withstand decades of questionable accounting to ultimately yield a fortune. While the exact net worth of the Nelson estate remains private, the impact of the victories is clear. When combining the settlement from Capitol Records, the reported $12.7 million fund from Sony, and the dramatically increased future royalties, it's clear the estate is now a valuable enterprise. Current estimates place the estate's value around $10 million, a remarkable turnaround from insolvency. The children set to inherit bills now oversee their father's valuable musical legacy. For his sons Gunnar and Matthew, the battles were about more than money. They were about vindication. For years, they lived with the story of their father's financial failures. These lawsuits were their way of forcing the industry to recognize the true value of their father's contribution. They weren't just fighting for royalties. They were fighting for respect. The impact also extends far beyond the Nelson family. The class action lawsuit against Sony set a powerful precedent for legacy artists in the streaming era. It exposed opaque accounting practices and forced a major label to change its ways. In death, Ricky Nelson became an unlikely pioneer for artists' rights in the 21st century, just as he had been a pioneer for rock and roll in the 20th. There is a profound irony in the final chapter of Ricky Nelson's story. The man who struggled for relevance in his later years left behind a legacy whose value only grew with time. The man whose personal finances were a mess had, through his art, built lasting wealth for his family. It proves that a person's true worth isn't always in their bank account. Ricky Nelson's real fortune was in the chords of Lonesome Town and the lyrics of Travelin' Man. It was in the art he created, which would continue to generate wealth long after he was gone. The incredible journey of Ricky Nelson's estate, from $1 million hole to a multi-million-dollar fortune, is one of the most dramatic turnarounds in music history. It's a story of hidden value, family perseverance, and a posthumous victory that changed the rules for an entire generation of artists. The whispers of debt and failure that followed his tragic death were finally silenced by the truth of his artistic and financial legacy. What do you think about this incredible story of posthumous justice? Are there other artists whose estates you think might be sitting on a hidden fortune? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more tales of hidden fortunes and the enduring legacies of Hollywood's greatest stars. Thanks for watching.